A very good morning to Principal Sir, distinguished resource persons and guests, my dear colleagues, participants, and students. Welcome back to the day 2 of our International Conference on Environment and Indigenous Knowledge System in South Asian Context, organized by Department of English in collaboration with IQAC of our college and WWF India. Looking back at yesterday, we had some incredibly stimulating discussions. So I would request our rapporteurs to present the key aspects and a brief overview of the sessions of day 1.
Respected Principal Sir, invited dignitaries, paper presenters, and my fellow colleagues. A very good morning to all of you. The International Conference on Environment and Indigenous Knowledge Systems in South Asian Context was held for 2 days. The first day we are already done away with. I'll present a report on that. And the second day sessions will be going on after the sessions of today. An international conference on environment and indigenous knowledge systems in South Asian context was held on 24th and 25th of March 2026, Nagaon Girls College. The event was organized by the Department of English in collaboration with IQAC, Nagaon Girls College, WWF India, and SBI Nagaon. The conference commenced with an address by the convener, Dr. Mridula Kashyap, followed by the felicitation of the distinguished guests and the principal of the college. The president of the governing body of Nagaon Girls College welcomed the gathering and highlighted the significance of indigenous knowledge related to local resources, emphasizing its crucial role in environmental protection and preservation. This was followed by the formal welcome address by Principal Sir Dr. Kulen Chandra Das, who stressed on the importance of indigenous knowledge systems in sustaining and preserving the biodiversity, sacred groves, and documentation of the indigenous knowledge of the communities at the local level. Followed by this, Dr. Sanchita Bora, coordinator of IQAC, further underscored the existential urgency of preserving cultural diversity, presenting it not merely as a cultural concern, but as a practical necessity. She asserted that indigenous knowledge systems are not outdated, rather they are highly relevant and essential in contemporary times. Following the inaugural addresses, the conference proceeded to the session of presentations by the distinguished invited guests and speakers. In his inaugural address, Anupam Sharma, team leader of WWF India, emphasized the idea of one blue planet and the rich tapestry of human existence. He elaborated on how traditional practices, such as seasonal restrictions on fishing, he gave many other examples, I have cited just a few, are not merely cultural customs, but are grounded in scientific understanding of the ecological life cycles. The keynote address was again delivered by Professor Charmali Nahalage from the Department of Anthropology, University of Sri Jayawardhanapura, Sri Lanka. Ma'am, it was very enlightening, and knowing about that how you presented about the Northeast, especially Meghalaya and the rest of the things, that was, very unexpected. We are expecting something more from Sri Lanka, but you were more into our country. Welcome, and thank you for that. She emphasized that identity, is solely cultural but also ecological. Her discussion focused on biodiversity stewardship and the importance of aligning it with contemporary sustainability goals and climate adaptation strategies. She highlighted the vital role of indigenous knowledge systems in biodiversity conservation, citing examples from the Bishnoi community, Chipko movement, which demonstrate the deep interconnections between culture, spirituality, and environmental protection. Thereafter, there was Dr. Deepak Gaiwali, political economist, former water resource minister from Nepal, who delivered the plenary lecture. He discussed on the evolving concept of globalization and argued for a shift towards localization, emphasizing self-sufficiency in basic needs as a core principle of indigenous knowledge systems. He critically examined the current global order, touching upon issues such as climate change, economic dependency, and the dominance of global financial systems. He also highlighted the problem of rigid disciplinary boundaries which hinder interdisciplinary dialogue and limit holistic approaches to development. Drawing from his observations, he noted And he acclaimed about his own and native country that Nepal's climatic policies are among the most progressive one globally. And probably his insight about Trump's Tandav and some other takeaway can be a resourceful insight for other countries as well, since we are talking about South Asian context. Apart from all these keynote speakers, there were 3 parallel sessions, offline sessions that we parallelly had in the college, and there was one online session also held in the second half of the first day of the seminar. The technical session 1, scheduled from 12:30 to 2 at the venue, was chaired by Dr. Bibhav Kumar Talukdar and Dr. Raktim Burman, and that featured 6 engaging and interdisciplinary papers that highlighted the relevance of indigenous knowledge systems across health, ecology, and education. The second session was chaired by Dr. Manisjyoti Bordoloi. That also featured 5 papers during the second session, and the third session was chaired by Professor Anuttara Devi Vidyalankara, ma'am, who chaired the third session and has given us insights on indigenous knowledge systems. And he has also cited some historical concepts, how we can incorporate in our knowledge systems and put up for the contemporary relevance. The session concluded with engaging discussions where participants reflected on the interdisciplinary relevance of indigenous knowledge in addressing ecological, social, and cultural concerns. There comes the end of the 3 engaging sessions of yesterday. Hopefully, we will have more insightful and engaging sessions today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neetu Gupta. It truly set a high benchmark for the days ahead, fostering a vibrant atmosphere of learning. So without much ado, let's get started. To open our plenary session, I would like to welcome to the dais our principal sir, plenary speakers Professor Anjali Demari and Mr. Neeraj Kakoti. I now take the honor to call Dr. Junali Mudoi from the Department of Education to felicitate our principal sir with a Fulam Gamucha. Thank you, ma'am. Next, I request Leena Bora Hazari from the Department of Economics to felicitate Professor Anjali Daimari with a Fulam Gamucha. The college memento. And a pack of books. I now call Dr. Prathana Hazarika from the Department of SMEs to felicitate Neeraj Kakoti with a Fulam Gamucha. The college memento and a pack of books. Let me now introduce Professor Anjali Daimari to everyone. Anjali Daimari is a professor and head in the Department of English, Guwahati University. She did her post-graduation and MPhil from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and her PhD from Nehu, Shillong. Her areas of interest are fiction, communicative English, African writing in English, contemporary South Asian literature, life writing, translation studies, writings from India's Northeast, and Boro life and literature. Her most recent work is Interpreting Literature from Northeast India, a book co-edited by Margaret Pachau, published by Bloomsbury in 2024. Apart from that, she has a long list of publications. Her other works include translation of Boro short stories into English. I now take the honor to please call ma'am to deliver her plenary speech.
A very good morning to all present. I'm privileged to be a part of this international conference on environment and indigenous knowledge system. Environment and indigenous knowledge system in the South Asian context, in the context of South Asia, organized by Nagaon Girls College. I'm grateful to the principal of the college and convener of the seminar, Dr. Mridula Kashyap, for the invitation, and of course to all the faculty of the English department, Nagaon College, and the college fraternity as such, because holding such a conference would involve a lot of people. So my gratitude and of course congratulations for them for hosting this very relevant seminar. There is now a spurt of engagement in Indian knowledge system and indigenous knowledge system, but this in no way makes the exercise, as I see it, redundant, because we still are at large and still entrapped in the structures of Western theoretical apparatuses and way of thinking and ways of knowing. So a seminar of this nature makes us all rethink our own knowledge bases. So the sub-themes identified in the concept note points out the levels of engagement that indigenous knowledge system requires. I'm sure in these 2 days, the sessions have dwelt on these diverse areas, and the important thing is it makes us to reflect on our own interpretive strategies. How we read texts, how do we use the available indigenous knowledges as not an alternative way of thinking, but the way how we read. Of course, like I know as we were just discussing in the morning, like there's been a spurt of seminars on indigenous Indian knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge system. So, but I think we still are looking for frameworks, so far as indigenous knowledge system is concerned, especially in literature departments, how we read text, and that is what my attempt is going to be. UNESCO, in fact, by centering indigenous voices, has underscored the need to integrate indigenous perspectives into global conservation, ensuring stronger protection of cultural and natural heritage while advancing the SDGs. When we are talking of environment and indigenous knowledge system, we are aligning with the SDGs, say number 11, which talks about sustainable cities and communities, SDG number 13, which talks about climate action, then number 14, which talks about life below water, and 15, life on land. Specifically, of course, everything else is interconnected, but these are directly related, these SDGs. So UNESCO has released a new report that emphasizes the central role of indigenous peoples in conserving and managing UNESCO-designated sites, including biosphere reserves, geoparks, World Heritage Sites, etc. So the report features a rich collection of testimonials, cultural expressions, and governance practices, demonstrating how indigenous knowledge systems, values, and cosmologies have long sustained both communities and ecosystems. So in keeping with the focus of this seminar, in this paper, the attempt would be to identify how the select writers in their works offer fertile ground for exploration of indigenous knowledge systems. Rooted in ecology, rituals, beliefs, and orality, we find an alternative universe where we as readers are made to reflect on how these indigenous knowledge systems sustain the communities until the coming of modernity. The working with indigenous and local knowledge, the writers bring into their narrative a recognition of the need to understand the local systems that frame their worlds. Of late, there is more and more acknowledgement that indigenous, traditional, and local knowledge systems constitute one of the largest bodies of human knowledge about biodiversity and ecosystems. So over the years, mostly as a consequence of colonialism, in most South Asian countries, certain forms of knowledge, certain voices, narratives, and belief systems have been devalued. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in fact, makes this point in his seminal work, Decolonizing the Mind, in the African context, and he advocates for decolonization of language and literature. Now, this conversation around the decolonization of knowledge needs to happen, and in Northeast India, we do find writers who have in their works made it a starting point of this conversation. So in this context, as a framework, I want to bring into discussion a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Okay, and the name of the book is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. You know, while I was preparing what to talk about, then I came across this book which I thought is very, very relevant, you know, when we are talking about indigenous knowledge system. This book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, she is a Native American, all right? So she writes in the opening chapter, Sky Woman Falling, and I quote her, "In other words, our relationship with the land cannot heal until we hear its stories. But who will tell them?" I think this is the crux, you know, even as we look into other works from Northeast writers. You know, I repeat, in other words, our relationship with the land cannot heal until we hear its stories. But who will tell them, unquote. This is in page 9 of the book. In this book, Kimmerer, a Native American belonging to Potawatomi tribe, dwells on the power of storytelling and how it brings harmony among humans and plants. She writes, and I quote her, "Our stories say that of all the plants, Vingash or sweet grass was the very first to grow on earth, is honored as one of the 4 sacred plants of my people," unquote. She speaks of the power of storytelling, and she says, and I quote, "The stories we choose to shape our behaviors have adaptive consequences," unquote. She poses the question, again I quote, "How in our modern world can we find our way to understand the earth as a gift again, to make our relations with the world sacred again," unquote. She continues, "Breathe in its scent, and you start to remember things that you didn't know you had forgotten. Our elders say that ceremonies are the way we remember to remember, and so sweetgrass is a powerful ceremonial plant cherished by many indigenous nations," because the title of her book is Braiding Sweetgrass, and she takes that at another level. She points to an important problem that is confronting humanity at large when she writes, and I quote, "As the land becomes impoverished, so too does the scope of their vision. How can we begin to move towards ecological and cultural sustainability if we cannot even imagine what the path feels like," unquote. Now she, in that particular book, she narrates the story of the Sky Woman's story. That is the story of the original peoples of the indigenous Potawatomis, okay? Then, as quoted by Kimmerman and stated by Gary Nabhan in the same book, she writes, "We can't meaningfully proceed with healing, with restoration, without restoration." I like that word, without restoration. I think this is a new word that I have found, which I'll be using it maybe more often. You know, like we say restoration, all right, recuperation. This is restoration. Okay, and that's a word by Gary Nabhan, which is quoted by Kimmerman in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. So speaking about her people, I think I'll skip this, she says in a chapter, she has a chapter of ceremonies, and I thought this is a very important chapter. You know how we emphasize a lot on festivals, on ceremonies, and she has a chapter on of ceremonies, and she discusses the importance of ceremonies and what it means to the indigenous peoples. Okay, and she quotes, ceremonies large and small have the power to focus attention to a way of living awake in the world, unquote. Ceremony is a vehicle for belonging to a family, to a people, and to the land. It's very important, you know, so I would repeat this line. Ceremony is a way for belonging to a people, to a family, to a people, and to the land. So, so this is where I bring a few Northeast writers in discussion, writers for whom stories become repositories of their indigeneity. Storytelling, an integral part of the passage of indigenous wisdom, has been adopted by several writers, and listening, as we understand, is the key to it. Kimmerman writes in the epilogue to her book, I quote her again, "I have been listening to stories that they have passed to me," unquote. So in studies on the environment, especially in discourses on environment humanities, in the contemporary moment, oral history and traditional wisdoms have imparted a significant body of knowledge besides encouraging empathy, sensitiveness, respect, and accommodation for our non-human and sentient life forms. Kimmerman emphasizes the importance of telling stories lest they be forgotten and before they are lost. So my paper is titled Reading Select Texts from Northeast India's Repositories of Indigeneity. So as the title points, you know, we'll look up a few creative voices from India's Northeast, because I'm again from the Department of English, so I would resort to the telling of the tales, you know, in the books that have been published by many Northeast writers. Of course, because of the limitation of time, it's not possible to bring into reference all the writers, but a few of the writers which I think are very central to begin with, because the stories they tell matter. Now, these writers bring to the readers the indigenous worldviews that are disappearing. In fact, they can be looked as attempts to recover lost traditions, cultures, languages, myths, legends, and beliefs, which are indigenous lifeways. In the wake of recent surge of interest in indigenous knowledge system and the ecology, already existing body of work on these lines provide a perspective how to approach these works. A discussion of these texts lead us to a discourse that shapes how these ideas find expression. The ecological and indigenous concerns are widely available in their works. I bring into reference the works of Mamang Dai, a writer from Arunachal Pradesh, Isterin Kire, a writer from Nagaland, and Rashmi Narzari, a writer from Assam. Their works, The Legends of Pensam, Son of a Thunder Cloud, When the River Sleeps, and Whistles of the Sifung, are steeped in indigenous folk tales, mythology, story, legends, and everyday life. Their works have recognized and articulated the increasing need to sustain indigenous and ecological lifeways. The setting and landscape of the stories transmit the readers to a green world. The Legends of Pensam opens on this note, and I quote, "When Ho-Ho first opened his eyes to the world, he saw green, a green wall of trees and bamboo, a green waterfall that sprayed his cheek and washed the giant fern that seemed to be waving to him," unquote. These are the first lines, how Legends of Pensam opens. And then she takes us to a world of legends and myths. As the stories move between the past and present, between tradition and modernity, there is an attempt by the writer to record the old legends, myths, rituals, and beliefs that govern the life of this indigenous community, that is the Adis. Legends of Pensam emerges as one of the most potent literary meditations on indigenous identity, memory, ecology, and the interface between myth and lived reality in contemporary Indian literature. Set in Arunachal Pradesh, the novel intricately weaves together stories across generations, blending folklore and oral tradition with urgent modern concerns. It's a collection of stories of 3 generations in a village of Arunachal Pradesh. So what stands out is Dai's descriptive ability. One can see the rivers, the green mountains, and you know, the mention of the food also, how it is prepared, all right, the paddy fields, you know, all of these sort of take us, you know, to a very pristine world. That's in the, I think in the first 3 sections of this story. And later on, you know, how sort of the changes, how modernity sets in, you know, with the coming of the missionaries, with the coming of the colonizers, and how the changes sort of, you know, happen and enter into that text, okay. So there are a host of memorable characters, you know, you have Ho-Ho, you have Rakut, you know, so you have all these characters, okay, and of course, Pinyard, the widow, all right, so there's a chapter, so you have all these characters, okay. So there are a host of memorable characters steeped in traditional tribal beliefs and living vulnerable lives, influenced by, you know, spirits, by shamans and unnatural events. People have premonitions, women dream dreams, babies are born who grow up unnaturally fast like deer or lion calves, and there are the stories of, you know, Birbik, you know, the water serpent. So you have, you know, so many tales, you know, which he continues throughout the narrative. Okay, like I was discussing earlier, how these writers sort of bring the orality, you know, the oral stories into writing. And I think that is, and we all understand that they are all very informed writers, most of these writers. So there's a consciousness on their part, you know, to bring, otherwise, you know, these stories, when they're not told, they will all be lost. You know, we know that they will all be lost, and therefore there's an attempt by the writers to, you know, to bring, so the term restoration, you know, how they're bringing the stories, the telling of the stories and listening of the stories, reading of the stories, you know, become important. So what draws, so shamans play an influential role in the tribe as they have power to exorcise the bad spirits and restore some order in life. Now coming to Istarin Kires very quickly, because how much time do I have? Okay, so what draws the readers to Istarin Kires, she's a writer from Nagaland that I'm referring to, Istarin Kire. Fictional works is the power of storytelling again, which is fable-like and takes readers to the oral and folk traditions which provide her the resources of her telling. When one reads works, you know, such as When the River Sleeps, and I have this book with me, The Son of a Thunder. I really love reading this book, Son of a Thundercloud, published in 2016. It immediately makes us to place her works together with maybe writers like Mario Vargas Llosa, maybe Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or maybe, you know, Leslie Silko. This is the nature, you know, of the work that she has written. So Istarin Kire in many of her interviews has revealed how she was inspired by writers like Chinua Achebe and Ngugiwa Thiong'o, more so Achebe, in the way both these writers brought over their oral narratives to the written tradition. She said this in one of her interviews. So she was inspired by their method of unapologetically presenting their cultural worldview without making any effort to make it understandable to the non-African reader, unquote. She firmly believes that it is the task of the reader to make the effort to get into the culture. In the indigenous cultures of Africa, communicating oral stories have been crucial for passing on culture-specific traditions and community memory. In the absence of a written culture, in these oral communities, there has always been a fear of stories being lost, especially in the context of the communities in Africa. So this brings into focus the need for storytelling in oral cultures like among the Nagas, and the reason why in works of writers like Istarin Kire, you know, storytelling is not only used as a narrative strategy, but how the stories told are part of the Naga lore, and through their telling, this transmission receives a continuity, albeit in a written mode. So we have storytellers, stories, and listeners, the audience. I think the audience is equal, whether it is in the oral form or whether it is in the written form. That is, the readers, they are very important. So in this way, she creates a mechanism to retrieve forgotten and untold stories of her tribe for preservation. Now, if we look into both these texts, we again find how the author incorporates traditional Naga folklore, environmental consciousness, and indigenous knowledge systems into her narratives. The novel serves as a rich repository of the indigenous knowledge system of the Tenemia Nagas. It chronicles when the river sleeps. Okay, it chronicles the journey of Vile, a lone hunter in search of mythical stone that brings immense power. Kire uses the narrative to document and preserve indigenous Naga culture, which faces threats from modernization and westernization. So the story portrays a world where spirits and humans exist on the same plane, with supernatural being as real as human society. The beliefs in the spirit world, the widow spirit, the were tigers, all of this prevail. In fact, I move on to the next story, that is Son of a Thundercloud. In Son of a Thundercloud, Isterin Kire combines lyrical storytelling with the magic and wisdom of Naga legends to produce an unforgettable, life-affirming fable. Her Son of a Thundercloud is a poignant narrative where the spiritual, mythical, and ecological worlds come together to narrate the journey of Pelevetso, short name is Pele in the novel, across these worlds. So Pele is a frame narrator in the novel who relates the physical world to the mystical world. The narrative, rich in Naga history and myths, highlights the man-nature relationship and simultaneously advocates for ecological sustainability. I want to read some portions from this particular novel, Son of a Thundercloud. Okay, I have quoted some and maybe I'll read from here. So there's a chapter called Pele in the novel, and talks about, Pele's village was called Nialuo. It was set on the western hills. Below the hills, there were many forests where the young men learned to hunt, and two small rivers where they fished and bathed. The older people of the village would often say, "It's the best place to live in. We are blessed. Our young should not think there are lands better than this to build a home. They belong here. They must take the place of their ancestors." They feared that if the young were not taught to love the village, it would soon be abandoned. They had seen it happen around them. This is on page 12 of the novel. Now, there's a reference to a great famine in the story that destroyed the people, made fields uncultivable, led to deaths of newborn babies. Now, the birth of the Son of Thundercloud is supposed to stop all these. And it's a story of these three sisters, Kethonuo, Siedze, and Mesanuo. And their son is, and the son of Mesanuo, which is called the son of the Thundercloud in the story. So there's also this legend about the tiger widow. Okay, so all of this fable, is built into the narrative. And there are some really powerful lines, over here. Like in this instance, you see there's a chapter called Our Mother. So it's the river, it is the river which is seen as the mother, all right? So here, there's a line like, the river is seen as the provider. So the river is seen as the mother, okay? The river was once a source of life for the village. Before the drought, fathers brought home river fish and fed their families. Women caught frogs and used as a medicinal broth when someone fell sick in the family. No one came back from the river empty-handed. There was food in the river, and so the villagers called it Our Mother. So how the river was called the mother. She gives us food, fish, frogs, herbs, and water. That's in page 55 of the novel. How the river, is seen, as a provider, sustaining life. Okay, and then in page 60 again, how Pele was given a plot of land. What Kimmerman talks about. About gift, among indigenous people. And so here we have, where Pele is given the gift of a plot of land. He comes from another place. And as he travels in the village of weavers, he is given a plot of land, by the by the headman, where he can build his house, he can have his own space, okay? So the making of the house, how the headman gave the field and says, you can have the field for free. And there's a lot of reference to the diverse food, that the Naga people take. Okay, there's reference to bamboo shoot and beans, okay, page 62. Then there's a lot of reference to storytellers, okay. It says, when I first came to live here, the earth was green and fertile. It's an echo of legends of Pensam again, When I first came to live here, the earth was green and fertile. There was food everywhere. No one tilled the fields because there was no need to. And there were storytellers who went all over the land telling stories to people and spreading joy and hope. This telling stories, and there's a lot of instance in the novel where, Railito is told stories, okay, by the mother, all right, and the importance of storytelling is emphasized over and over again, in the narrative. Now, there's a statement like in page 63 and 64, without stories, people believed they were destined to suffer, and they allowed the dark ones to enslave the minds and fill them with fear and sorrow and despair until they died. So, in fact, there's a lot of reference to stories, and of course, the sense of community, which comes. See, now it's about education. In fact, there's a chapter, chapter 18, page 108, it says. It's about when the boy was born. In a year's time, the boy had learned to gather edible berries and detect which mushrooms were poisonous and which were full of nutrition. He still managed to bring home herbs that had to be thrown out, but he was slowly learning the names of the herbs and their habitat. It was the best education anyone could have. The kind of education that children get even while growing up in those native spaces. There's a lot of reference. You can take the book and you can read up. There's this emphasis on storytelling which we find again and again in this particular book. You can just take up. Okay. So then coming to Whistles of the Sifung, Tales from Assam's Bodo Heartland, I have to admit that I have not read the entire book. Okay. I read only the first 3 chapters. Because this is a book I just ordered recently, okay? So just 3 stories I have read from here, the first 3 the stories, okay? But there's enough in this book if you read the introduction is also, and also, the table bearer Asidoburi, okay? And then, also what I find, what Kimmerman talks about is the reference to ceremonies, the importance of festivals, because here in this story she talks about this 3 friends going to this festival, this Junbeli Mela, okay, where this 3 friends come to, and this system of barter which is there. They come with their things, and how this Ojhai Borai, he comes with his sifung, all right, he comes with his sifung, and how the sifung is so dear to him. He doesn't want to part with his sifung, and he wants to part with his sifung. Is a musical instrument, which is I think which the Boros really hold it dear and they play, all right. So it's a musical instrument, and how he doesn't want to part with the sifung as such, but he would give sifung to the person who would play the music and entertain the public. So that is the condition of him, parting the sifung with one lady who really loves the sifung, but she does not have anything to barter with. But then he says, I'll give you on one pretext that, on one condition, that, if you will play it, and then, so that will be my gift from you. Okay, so I'm just saying, so dedicating the book to table bearers, the one who keeps the past alive and moving, Rashmi Nazari brings together spirits and shamans, nature and culture, songs and music in 8 exquisite stories, embodying in spirit the 12-fingered Asidoburi, the living chronicle of the indigenous Boros in the stories. She explores the culture, folklore, and contemporary life of the Boro community in Assam, woven around the magical melodies of the sifung, a traditional Boro flute. The stories revolve around old Ojai and his sifung, which is depicted as possessing magical powers to enchant spirits, Humans and Nature Itself. The collection features 8 tales that blend folklore and realism. It features traditional musical instruments, other instruments as well, like kham and jotha, to portray the rich cultural tapestry of the region. Now, Asido Buri was a living chronicle. I quote from the text, okay? Asido Buri was a living chronicle of the indigenous Bodos. She had nothing documented, yet everything was stored in her unfaded memory in detail. From the knowledge of the amazing array of medicinal herbs and methods among Boros to the wars and battles they fought and won, and the borders they marked for their lands through the ages. Now, the story that I was talking about. Myra wanted the sifung, but she had nothing to barter it with. And then the old man says, "Take this with you." Ojai says, "Your word, promise me that you and the sifung will together bring joy to others." So it is on that condition only he is going to part with his. He's going to give the precious sifung to Myra, this girl who really wanted the sifung. Okay, so I mean, you'll have to read the entire story to see all of it, how she brings into all this indigenous, how the indigenous knowledges work, in her story. And Kimmerman, in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, metaphorically and thematically weaves the braid from 3 strands: indigenous ways of knowing, scientific knowledge, and the story of the native scientists that intertwine science, spirit, and story for mending a broken relationship with the earth, unquote. She thus imagines a different future in which people and land are good medicine for each other. In conclusion, I want to close by referring to an essay I had recently read, which is published in Essay on Science and Society, Will Tribal Knowledge Survive the Millennium, by Paul Allen Cox. Okay? He writes, "What pieces of knowledge do we treasure that come from 1,000 years ago?" Citing the example of a Samoan lady who he met, the example of a Samoan lady, Epenesa Moigoa, a diminutive 73-year-old who tended her infirm husband in the modest hut on the outskirts of Apia, Western Samoa. "Do you know anything about herbal medicine?" He asks her, and then she says, "I know a little." Epenesa quietly replied. Then for the next 3 hours, I'm quoting him, okay, the writer, then for the next 3 hours, as I rapidly typed on my laptop computer, Epenesa related the most detailed account of the Samoan herbal medicine that I have ever recorded. By the end of our session, several weeks later, Epenesa had taught me the details of 121 different herbal remedies. She carefully mixed from 90 different species of flowering plants and herbs. The 37th remedy, Epenesa told me, caught my attention. Epenesa claimed to be able to treat 5 samasanza, a term used to describe hepatitis. So after that, the US government guaranteed that half of all royalty income from prostratin will go back to the people of Samoa, which is one of the first formal legal recognitions of indigenous intellectual property rights. The significance is clear, as he writes. An indigenous claim of efficacy of a plant used in traditional medicine had been corroborated by a laboratory finding. So this is what he comes to, and he says, of course, he talks about many other things. He talks about the loss of language and all those things, and how it is important that all this should come together, and how like an indigenous lady, the Samoan lady, and what the medicines that the plants she found, actually found a remedy for other ailments. Okay, sociologist Ulrich Beck remarks about debates over species extinction. Only if nature is brought into people's everyday images, into the stories they tell, can its beauty and its suffering can be seen and focused on. That is quoted by Lawrence Buell in Writing for an Endangered World in 2001. So the success, and as Buell writes in this particular book, and I quote, "The success of all environmentalist efforts finally hinges not on some highly developed technology or some arcane new science, but on a state of mind, on attitudes, feelings, images, narratives." Perhaps it's only proper to conclude in Esther Nkire's words in Barcelona Dreamtime, "I believe that stories are powerful. They have the power to transform lives. the magic to work peace. And then it is so important that they be told in any way. Thank you.
Light on the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, the power of storytelling and how storytelling becomes a part of indigenous culture, and also a new perspective, a new concept called restoration. Thank you so much. Now let me introduce to you Mr. Neeraj Kakoti, our next plenary speaker. Mr. Neeraj Kakoti is a conservation professional with over 18 years of experience across the government and NGO sectors. From implementing conservation projects with the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, ATREE, Bangalore, to capacity building on UNESCO Natural Heritage with the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun, Mr. Kakoti is now the Deputy Team Leader, Brahmaputra Landscape, WWF India, based in Assam. He is proficient in fostering multi-stakeholder collaborations, executing complex projects in protected areas, and engaging with local communities in field sites. With a post-graduation qualification in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, he is inclined towards an interdisciplinary approach to conservation. Now I call Kakoti to deliver his plenary speech.
Hello and a very good morning to all of you. Respected Principal, Professor Kulen Chandra Das, Madam Anjali Doimari, esteemed guests from Nepal and Sri Lanka, faculty of Nagaon Girls College, students and researchers who are present here. It's a privilege for me to be part of this international conference and a very relevant topic, not just for all of us in general, but also in terms of the background that I come from. And I'm associated with the WWF, dealing with wildlife and forest conservation. So major part of my presentation today will focus on how indigenous knowledge systems are so directly associated with environment, ecology, and sustainability. And in fact, before I start, I was wondering, since yesterday, we are actually all walking and living beings of indigenous knowledge. I just noticed this gamusa which I'm wearing. So all these motifs that have been put up here, this is part of the indigenous knowledge of Assamese society. Okay, it has gone on for many generations. Nobody's written it down that we have to do it this way. Okay, this is something that has gone off. And then I've noticed Madam is wearing a very beautiful mekhala sadar. Many other faculty are wearing different mekhala sadar with other motifs. Yesterday, our esteemed guest from Sri Lanka was wearing a traditional, attire from Sri Lanka. These are all part of the indigenous knowledge systems and what is called, traditional cultural expressions of our culture and society. So we actually are always living in this particular environment. Coming to my particular presentation, local to global, and I would just like to clarify this. I think it should be more appropriate local to local. Why? Because indigenous knowledge is ultimately starting absolutely from the local, but given the state and the condition that we have managed to get this into, it has taken the global, the world and the global community to realize and acknowledge that indigenous knowledge is something that we need to conserve and protect, and it has been neglected. So ultimately, again, I always have to come down to the local level. My presentation, very broadly in about 3 broad parts, I want to give you a very basic context of how indigenous knowledge in environment and ecology can be seen in the northeastern states of India, okay, in that context. Subsequently, I want to state how has India as a country tried to protect this indigenous knowledge, and finally, at the global level, how has this played out? The agenda for indigenous knowledge, how has it played out at global level, and how the countries and the local level have sort of basically adapted from the global itself. Very basic. This is something I think you have been exposed to since yesterday. What is exactly indigenous knowledge? from being something which is a traditional community-based knowledge, which is part of a very specific context. And of course, we have been hearing that it is mostly oral, which is passed down through generations. And it is not just knowledge, but it also demonstrates skill in as many terms. Okay, it's both knowledge as well as skill. It's how we look at it. And if you see how it is manifested in indigenous knowledge, so it could be things like folklore, stories, mythology, cultural values, it in many different ways. Just as ma'am was talking about many of the stories that she read right now, that how herbs and seeds were identified at at that level, from a family, at the level of a family, how a different particular attire of a community, okay, was so precious to a particular person and individual. And these are all part of the indigenous knowledge that we grow up with, okay, and they manifest it. But what is important, I would like to draw your attention, that indigenous peoples, from where the source of knowledge is, they make up, barely how much? Just about 2% or of the 6% of the world's population. But they, about 20%, of the territory of the world, of the global world that they reside in, and which protect nearly 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So from a 6% population globally, they but protect about 80% of the world's global biodiversity. So that is how significant it is, IKS in short, in terms of how ecology and biodiversity needs to be conserved. But before I start, I was specific about the Northeast context. In terms of the academic discourse, in fact, the fact that we are standing here today talking about indigenous as a knowledge system, I think this is something that we should not have had to specifically talk about. Knowledge is knowledge, okay, it is just there. Why are we differentiating it into indigenous or modern or Western? But this is a legacy that we have had to actually, bear because of this Western cultural tradition. So how, and this entire thing is based on this dichotomy and dualism between what is nature and what is culture. So the Western tradition actually, they posited nature as very different from culture. So human society was looked as being different from nature, okay? And not just different, but in terms of our hierarchical relationship. So it was like, we are human beings, we have the right to own, to exploit, and to use the natural resources, okay? And because of this, over the last 200, 300, 400 years, we are talking today about climate change, about deforestation, about erosion, and all the elements, negative elements of environment. Because we always sort of placed ourselves from a Western point of view as different from what nature is. This is in direct contrast to what the Asian overall, not just South Asian, but overall Asian societal tradition, they always, understood that they were part of nature. So human beings and the societies who lived in these areas, for them nature was nothing different. Okay, it was part of their life, part of their society. They lived off the nature where they stayed. They also influenced the landscape around it, but they also adapted to what the environment was. So people in the mountainous region, they made their own arrangements and adaptation, how to survive in those areas. Similarly, people in the plains, people who lived near the river systems, they found their own ways to adapt to those conditions. And they always, it was a mutual, actually, symbiotic relationship where they never thought it two separate elements. But because of this dichotomy, today we are talking about indigenous as a separate system. But fortunately, and to our good fortune, I would say that over the last, in fact, 2, 3, 4 decades, this knowledge and this, cross-disciplinary studies from sociology to history to environmental anthropology, in fact, even to conservation biologists who, work in the field, they all realize that we cannot see these two things together separately. We have to see them together. And if this we would see together, we would not have indigenous as a separate knowledge system, but as one common. This is purely from the academic discourse point of view. If we talk about just specifically Northeast, about 7 to 8 states that we consider, you are all aware of, they are also from an ecology point of view, they are part of these what are called global biodiversity hotspots. So areas which are tremendously rich in biodiversity, not found in many other parts of the world. And in fact, out of only 36 such designated hotspots in the world, Within India itself, there are 5 such hotspots, and within the Northeast, there are 2 hotspots that we overlap. One is called the Eastern Himalaya, and the other is called the Indo-Burma hotspot. So biodiversity, resource species, the vegetation which are found in these areas are very unique, very special. And this, along with this biodiversity, as I was telling you, just look at the diversity of indigenous tribal population that we have. So nearly 200 plus indigenous tribes just in this particular area of the Northeast region, which is, you know, just about less than 1/5 of even India's own population. So indigenous societies, biodiversity, almost an absolute direct correlation. That where they are rich in these societies, even the biodiversity is as rich. So that is how, you know, the commonality between them is. I won't go through all these individual examples, but if you were to see some of these indigenous practices of, you know, tribal societies in the Northeast, many of these were mentioned the other day, yesterday also you would have come across many of these. I would ask you to just put attention to the third column. You know, how all these practices have value from an environmental point of view. So, you know, we have sacred groves in Meghalaya, Nagaland, and many of the Northeast states. What do they bring and contribute to the, you know, environment? So things like they act as carbon sinks because of the rich, you know, vegetation that they have. They are water sources, and they are also habitats for many endemic species. They are absolutely naturally protected. There is no law but customary law, you know, normative customary law, where the communities themselves protect these things. Things like shifting cultivation. There's a lot of debate about shifting cultivation, how good or bad it is for the environment. But if you leave it only to the societies, they had found their own way of, you know, fallow periods, about own way of leaving these things for a particular time so that the soil fertility could be restored. Similarly, things like an integrated farming system like what we know of the Apatani in Arunachal Pradesh, where it is, I think, probably one of those examples of what you would call a non-vegetarian rice. We've probably never heard of that, yeah? But where rice and fish are cultivated at the same place. You may want to see it that way. Similarly, things like community forest management. In many other areas they are, but the Northeast specifically, you know, specialize in community forest management, where this local stewardship and decentralized governance provide a kind of, you know, stake and ownership for these societies to preserve their own resources. You don't need a government from, you know, the headquarters, maybe in Guwahati for Assam or from Delhi, to negotiate these kind of rules and resources. Similarly, things like a bamboo drip irrigation system, then indigenous beekeeping. Okay, many of these areas, right now there are a lot of other commercial systems have come in, but, you know, these indigenous systems have a lot of natural value in terms of how they support pollination at the local level. Ethnobotany, again, a very significant element of indigenous knowledge, and what this does is provides absolute local access, you know, very low cost. They are naturally, you know, naturally available ingredients with no side effects. So these are some things that we need to encourage. And of course, in general, indigenous communities and knowledge, they demonstrate a lot of cultural, you know, values and eco-consciousness at their natural level. You know, they reinforce these entire ecological cycles that where they live in. So from a Northeast point of view, very rich, very closely connected indigenous knowledge and the ecology and environment and how they are protected. But of course, with new populations increasing, modernization trends, these have facing increasing challenges and stresses. Now here, we keep talking about how we need to protect it, but yes, it is not that the country or the government has not taken measures. They have. And there have been a number of, you know, laws, acts and regulations which India has attempted to, you know, implement in terms of how to protect, starting all the way from when the Constitution itself was established. You all have heard about the 6th schedule and 5th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Many states of the Northeast are part of the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution, the tribal states. Then there is something also called the 5th schedule, where tribal or scheduled areas in about 10 other states of the country, things like Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Andhra Pradesh, they all have very strong tribal areas. There's also a schedule for that. So all these schedules have provided a centralized or decentralized governance system, providing them more ownership of their own local resources. So that is how, you know, indigenous systems have a framework to be protected. How much they are doing it is a completely different matter, actually. Then in terms of patent and intellectual property rights, Madam has also mentioned something. So there is something called the Geographical Indication Act. You've heard of GI? You've heard of GI tags, yeah? There are particular elements of production and products that we prepare which are absolutely local to the location and geography of this area. So Geographical Indication as well as the Trademarks Act do have provisions to, in terms of protecting the patents for indigenous knowledge systems. But again, in implementation, these have not gone to the level that we would seek to actually. A very interesting innovation or initiative that the government took was what is called the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library. So this was put up so that, for the government with the CSIR, what is called the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research of the Government of India, they put up this digital database where traditional knowledge could be inventorized and protected and conserved so that people could get a direct access to it. Then very specifically about seeds, and agriculture. So there is something called the Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act. This is again during the pre-2000. But the most significant legislation in terms of indigenous knowledge, if you would talk about, is what is called the Biological Diversity Act, okay, which came in 2002, and subsequently the rules have come in. So here you've heard of biodiversity management committees and what are called PBRs, People's Biodiversity Registers. So this was for the first time that the communities and the indigenous communities were given direct, ownership and stake in terms of documenting their own resources, okay, and how they could control the resources, what is the information and knowledge that they would like to, keep. So this Biological Diversity Act has been a most significant actually legislation from the Indian point of view. Subsequently also something in 2006 came, what is called the Forest Rights Act. Again, here it was more about land and tenure of people who have been living in these forests for many centuries, okay, across almost 3 generations, so that they have ownership to their own land and tenure. So these have been the more generic, Indian legislations. But what is very interesting is this thing on the right that I put up, if you see, where very specifically Protection of Traditional Knowledge Bill. So this has not become an act as yet. It is still under discussion. In 2022, this was introduced as a bill in the parliament, yet not been implemented or enacted. But this is something that is going to be a very omnibus legislation which will try and take care of all things traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and the protection systems will be from a completely centralized point of view, where all the indigenous systems will tend to be protected. And there's going to be something called a National Authority for Traditional Knowledge that will be established. So there are legislations and there are frameworks which have been attempted. Of course, in terms of how they have been implemented is something that is, the jury is still out on that. And coming to how the global agenda, the indigenous system is reflected in the global agenda. In fact, this has actually played a very crucial role. Many of the domestic legislations have been actually drawn from this global agenda. So it is actually embarrassing, it may be unfortunate that the world community had to come together to save something which is absolutely an owner and a localized element from a particular country and within a particular region, but the world had to come together to come and conserve or protect it. But if you see, I'll not go into too much of details, mostly it is the United Nations system that has tried to get all these countries together to agree to a common framework to protect indigenous knowledge. And you would see a lot of the UN frameworks, the UN and international conferences, UNESCO, I mentioned about UNESCO and heritage, which has played a very key role in terms of trying to protect indigenous knowledge and indigenous people's rights. But if you just see the trend, you notice the first column and the last column, how the trends of indigenous peoples, how they have been seen. So in the pre-1970s, so just about 50 years, only about 50 years before this, pre-1970s, people, tribal societies, indigenous people were seen as obstacles to conservation. Okay, so protected areas were made, they were made in a sense that we have fenced this out, no people should come here. Okay, they are damaging. So that was what the model was. But of course, over the next 20, 30 years, this does not work in the field. Subsequently, in the 80s and 90s, the people came to be recognized and acknowledged as actual stakeholders in biodiversity conservation. we, even as conservationists, when you go to the field, we realize that we cannot keep the people who have stayed in those areas for such a many generations. You cannot keep them out and go and protect a particular species or an animal or a forest. If you do not take them on board, ultimately you will only come to harm, okay? Because they are going to be there, you cannot leave them away. So it became to be acknowledged. But it was in the 2000s, as the 21st century turned, over the first 10, 15 years of the 21st century, that actually lot of the rights came to be, codified. And the major UN systems, UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous People, the Paris Agreement on Climate, okay, and the UNFCCC, then the Sustainable Development Goals. We keep now hearing everywhere we talk about SDG. So IKS is a very integral component of the SDGs. And it was this particular period which focused on, the legal land rights and consent of the people. Till before this, the countries and the governments would just do their own business. But now this is codified that something called, have you heard of something called FPIC? Free, prior and informed consent. So no work in the tribal areas with indigenous communities can you now do, even as part of your own research, without taking consent from these people, which is free, which you have to inform them beforehand, not after doing your research. You cannot do your research and come and tell them, we have published this. No, because it is their knowledge. It is their information. You have to tell them prior, okay, and take their consent. So these are things which have been codified. And of course, over the last 10 years or so, now more and more, they are not just stakeholders, but indigenous communities have been now considered as absolutely integral partners, both in the conservation as well as in the research part of indigenous communities. And many different, international movements have taken place. So there's something called the nature culture journey. IUCN, this is an international scientific organization. Then there is something called the ICOMOS, okay, International Council on Monuments and Sites, which deals with cultural monuments. So both these organizations actually came together to say that we need to build this, what is called the nature culture journey, so that they are seen as one continuum. Nature is not separate, culture is not separate. We need to see them as an integrated whole. And this is how the trend, global evolution has taken place, where indigenous people now are more seen as a very integral part of the entire decision and policy making system. And many countries have actually drawn inspiration from these international agreements to make their own laws and legislations. So despite all this evolution and despite this integration of indigenous communities, there are of course challenges are going to remain. For the societies themselves, everybody wants modernization, we also want, right? We want all the development attributes. We want to have an AC room, we want to travel in a flight, we want all the perks and all the comforts, so as well as societies who are staying in those areas. So more and more as they go into modernization, the original people are sort of moving out of the villages. They want to go and study outside, reside outside because of the facilities. Many of these practices or the knowledge is slowly, little bit is starting to getting lost across generations. Then of course, climate change. Sir, Mr. Pradeep Gyali from yesterday had mentioned a lot about how climate action and climate change has had a very major impact on water and overall society as such. And indigenous communities and tribal areas will particularly face the brunt of this, climate impacts. And will they be in a position to actually adapt to it? Because the climate actions are taking place or changes are taking place at a rate faster than they are in a position to, adapt to them. Of course, policy has been neglected. Recently, in recent years, this has come forward. There has been a very conflict between what conservation laws and our tribal rights could be. Okay, we always face this. What is the rights of the people there, but what is the rights of conservation laws that we should say? Insecurity of the tenure, that is a very big issue for people because they stay in if they don't have rights over their own land, it is something like we have our own territory, but if we don't have a patta land, we will be very insecure. Tomorrow, government can take our land. Yeah. And a very significant part of knowledge, when you talk about knowledge and documentation, it is about the sovereignty of the data, okay? So we have taken the information and knowledge from the people on the ground, and how are we using it? Are we using it to our advantage, and they are not getting any benefit out of it? So what is the control that they will have over their own knowledge which they have shared with the others? So these are things which absolutely will require completely different discussion at all. And in terms of the opportunities going ahead, of course, we need to integrate this more into the policy aspects. in practice, more and more of the community-led conservation projects, rather than driven from the top-down approach. Ecotourism we have heard of, the people need to get benefits, but can ecotourism be held and sort of implemented from a more sort of indigenous practices point of view? Of course, we are talking about indigenous knowledge as mostly oral tradition, but do you think that it will have value if you document these indigenous practices? We have to be careful, yes. If we document, will somebody misuse it? But yet, documentation will probably enhance the sustainability over a longer period of time, and it'll create more power to the people who have this. So these are some of the opportunities that we need to go forward, looking at how we integrate indigenous knowledge with environment and ecology. And to conclude, not to say the least, indigenous knowledge by no means is it something that is only primitive or old that we think of. It is very highly adaptive, it is very evolving. People change, the environment changes, nature changes, and we all survive. We know, we just find our way out, so long as you're giving them the, the space, you're giving them the authority and right to practice their things. And in terms of sustainable development, there's absolutely almost no argument that indigenous knowledge systems have to be conserved to, take forward biodiversity and conservation. And at the end, we must call for respect, recognition, and integration of indigenous systems in our policy, in our everyday life, and also in our academic curriculums. How can we acknowledge and understand indigenous systems in all our systems of actual even studies and disciplines? So thank you on my behalf and on behalf of WWF. We are proud to be associated with this particular conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your enlightening words, shedding light on the concept of nature-culture journey, then breaking the dichotomy between, man and nature, and document how documentation of indigenous knowledge is important for protection of biodiversity. And now, I request Pikli Buraguhai to deliver the vote of thanks.
At the outset, I express my heartfelt gratitude to our principal, Dr. Kulan Chandra Das, for his guidance and leadership in making this conference a success. I extend my sincere thanks to our distinguished resource persons, Dr. Charmali Nahalage, who has traveled all the way from Sri Lanka, and Professor Deepak Gawali, who has come from Nepal, for sharing their valuable insights and enriching this academic gathering. I would also like to express a deep appreciation to our sponsors, OIL, SBI, and WWF. Without their generous support, this conference would not have been possible. We are especially thankful to WWF for collaborating with us in organizing this important event. My special thanks goes to Dr. Anjali Doimari and Niraj Kakoti for delivering the plenary lecture. I would like to acknowledge the efforts of Dr. Sanchita Bora, coordinator of IQAC, and Dr. Mridula Kaishyap, convener of the conference, whose dedication and hard work have been instrumental in the successful organization of the event. I also extend my gratitude to my fellow co-conveners, all the members of the organizing committee, my colleagues, both the teaching and the non-teaching staff, for the tireless efforts. A special mention goes to our very enthusiastic volunteers from NCC, NSS, and the union body, as well as all the students of the college for their active participation and support. Finally, I thank all the paper presenters and the dignitaries present here, whose valuable contributions have truly enriched the academic spirit of the conference. With this, I conclude the vote of thanks. Thank you all for your presence and participation.